Good evening, and after that absolutely fascinating session on AI and the world of the future, uh, let's delve a little deeper into something very different, but also a lot about empowerment. Empowerment and the road to empowerment on a global level is what this discussion we hope to achieve in. McKinsey Global Institute has put out a very deep dive and an excellent report on poverty to employment, from poverty to empowerment, and that's the report which Sven here has authored. That has some very major elements which need to actually, which can actually come up with a completely different definition of what growth stands for, what actually human index levels are about, and where we can actually take the world to. And this is very significant because it comes at a time when the B20 meetings are happening in the city and the G20 Leaders Summit is going to happen over the next few days. So I'll start with you first, Sven. Tell us a little about this report which you've put together, from poverty to empowerment, and what are the elements which you think are going to really change the way we look at global empowerment of people?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's great to be in India. The mood here is good, and I think that's only for good reasons. I just want to reinforce that. When we looked at this question of sustainable, inclusive growth, we tried to do that not by looking at silos, growth, sustainability, or empowerment, but to do all three at the same time and look at the interactions. Why is that? If you would look at sustainability alone, you could say, let's do that at any cost. But that might impede growth, and it might impede the empowerment of people. If you look at growth and sustainability alone without empowerment, you might say, I'm happy with where we are now. We're moving past the poverty line. But when we looked at the prosperity of people, we only have 700, 800 million people living below the poverty line. That poverty line is, you remember maybe as $1 a day, but it's actually $2.15 a day now in the redefinition. But for that, an average person basically gets food, but not always, and a little bit of shelter, and a little bit of care. We think that line needs to go from 215 to 12. So still 700 to 800 million people need to pass the poverty line, but about 4.8 billion people need to pass the empowerment line. The empowerment line is very different. At that level, people have decent food, decent shelter, decent education, and decent health care. And also a little bit of discretionary spending. So in a moment of stress, they don't go back to subsistence. And people that live at that level actually are empowered. What does that mean? They want to participate in society. They also want to engage on topics of growth and sustainability. If you barely have food, sustainability can't be a question for you because you just don't have time for it. And so we think this puzzle needs to be solved across all three, and we will get different answers. In, I would say, the Western world, people say, maybe we should grow less. That's not true in India, but in the West, we should grow less because that creates additional footprint. Well, our report shows something else. More growth does increase the footprint, but it creates so much more money to pay for the transition that the transition becomes easier. That's counterintuitive, but you would not find it if you were to only look in these silos.
We'll come to this issue of growth versus net zero a little later, Sven. Yep. I want to spend a few moments getting you to explain how you came about this idea of the empowerment quotient. Because, and how, what are the few things you kept in mind? Because that's a very different way of looking at prosperity. We look at GDP, we look at growth, we look at the usual parameters. What are the critically different areas this empowerment quotient brings forward?
So this empowerment line literally looks at how people live their lives, which is, at the end of the day, why we do all this thing called growth. And this poverty line, I can't repeat this more enough, really measures $1 of the $2 is food, and $1 is for all the rest. But for $1 of food, you eat not so good food, and not always. You might have a period in life that you don't have enough. That's the life of these people. The people that would live, and already live, of course, they exist, that live at $12 a day per person, they actually, you would find, have a house, a small apartment. They would have access to critical health care. They would have access to education, and they would not struggle for food. And the biggest thing is they have a little bit of savings, so they're not really living from paycheck to paycheck anymore, which is a very different life. The most important point is the people that live that life participate in society completely differently. They're not just fighting for themselves. They can actually work the community. They can start to have an interest about the environment, about the wider community, and so on. And we just think that's a life that everybody deserves. Not easy, but you can make massive progress through growth and a few other things towards that.
Tell us a little more about how you think, you talked about not being viewed in silos. For instance, empowerment and net zero are two different, not two different things. They are actually need to be seen together. Tell us how you see that as being possible in countries across the world when there is a basic, when there is so much, and we'll come to the different areas of how much money is needed, what is the funding, and all of that. But how do you think that is possible, and why you think net zero is so critical to empowerment, and that they should go together?
Yeah, so it goes two ways. If we make the transition too expensive, you can forget about empowerment, because basically people can't pay for it. We know in the North-South discussion on net zero, there's a discussion, are you going to pay from the North? That might be less proactive than we want now. But that if the people in the South are not empowered, they don't have the ability to pay. So it goes both ways. If the transition is designed to be affordable, it becomes more easy to be empowered. But if you're empowered, it's also easier to participate in the transition and to invest. A person below the poverty line can't invest. A person at $12 a day could be part of the investment into the transition. So it works both ways.
Gautam, let me come to you from your perch, from an Asian perspective. How do you see what Sven is talking about playing out in Asia, particularly in the context now of also Prime Minister Modi's position that India needs to also be the voice of the global South? How do you think these two things can be married as the progress, the road to progress happens?
So I think everything that Sven talked about globally is very relevant for Asia, if anything even more relevant for Asia. I think Asia, as you know, is now 40% of the world's GDP, and half of the global growth in the future is expected to come from Asia. So Asia is in fact driving the world's consumption, the world's growth, but equally the sustainability challenge is massive for Asia. Right. You look at 5 of the 10 biggest emitters in the world, they sit in Asia. And by the way, India is one of them. So I think you see, and the last thing I'd say is the inclusion challenge. Worldwide, while we have seen about 1 billion people have been pulled out of the poverty line, I think a large number of people are still below what Sven said is the empowerment line, right? And if you look at that, India, China alone would probably constitute, India, China, and, well, sub-Saharan Africa is a bit outside of Asia. But some of these markets...
In fact, his study, just to interject, his study says 77% of Indians are still below the empowerment
That's correct,
line.
that's correct.
And that's a significant, that's an alarming figure.
Yeah, I think, well, they're both, whether you decide to look at the glass half full or empty, well, there's no doubt that in India, and I say this as a proud Indian, over the last few decades, growth has pulled a lot of people above the poverty line. There's no question about that. Right? Yet we know the inclusion challenge. You see, in India, if you look at the top 10% of India, in terms of economic wealth, their income is growing at 100% rate of the bottom half. So the top 10% of Indians' income is growing almost double, 100% more than the bottom half of India. So the inclusion challenge in India is massive. When we looked at the McKinsey Global Institute definition of empowerment, it is true that 77% of the population in India is below the empowerment line. So we need to pull them up. We need to pull them up. I'll tell you why I'm optimistic, because you may say that's an alarmist number, but the reason I'm optimistic is because 90% of that problem, at least in India's case, will get solved if we deliver on our growth ambition and deliver those value-added jobs. So unlike other markets that don't have that kind of growth headroom, India has that headroom. So growth in the fundamental growth in the economy and business model innovation can get us to 90% of the distance. In fact, the report says that if you look at India's need, we need about 13% of GDP to address the empowerment gap. 90% of that can be addressed through growth and business innovation. So that makes me optimistic.
Sven, coming back to the empowerment gap and the net zero gap, the figure, again, which your study talks about is humongous. And you talk about an 8% of GDP figure annually as the gap. Could you tell us what are the areas you think, and in the context of the debate at B20, where we are looking at areas of funding the climate actions and the SDG goals, how do you think that this whole gap, 8% of GDP at a global level, is humongous? So how do you see that playing out, and do you really think, to sum it up, is your study a tad too optimistic while giving these scary figures?
It's interesting, depending on where I have this discussion, whether I get the too optimistic or the too pessimistic. I would say here in India, I've heard more too optimistic, and I would say in the Western world, we get challenged for why do you say it's so big and it's still a challenge. The 8% of GDP annually is humongous. I fully agree with you. It's roughly the amount of profit all corporations in the world make every year. So if we were to just say tax it, all the profits are gone. If you put it in prices, all the consumers will get that pain every year. So that's not going to be the solution. Similar to Gautam's answer is the first thing we showed in this report, that about 65% of the empowerment gap and about 45% of the net zero financing and challenge can be done by growth and business-led innovation. Since that's the biggest chunk, it has to be almost all of the conversation first. And then the question is, how do we solve the remaining gap? But we don't have enough conversation around that growth and business-led innovation. Are we literally doing the permitting, the regulation that frees up the system that can do the business-led innovation to solve much of this problem? In Europe, permitting is the single biggest bottleneck for wind. Labor laws are, and I'm sure that's true in India in many ways, and there's a lot of stuff like that that can unleash that engine and maybe even make it a bit bigger. So that should be one conversation. And then the question is, what do you do with the remaining gap? Because the remaining gap is then still humongous. In some countries, people will say, we can't swallow that now, and they will delay it. In other countries, we might do something where you have some public financing, and in blended finance, you can crowd in more investment, and you sort of say, long-term investments, and we don't kick the can down the road, but we bring the can forward on the road, if you want. And the reason why we even put out a report where that remaining gap is not fully solved is to actually have the conversation. Because if you have the conversation without the numbers, you could build the train that runs off the tracks. If you have this perspective, you can actually start to decide what train you're building. A little delayed, a little modified, a little pre-invested, and so on. But let's just be clear. This challenge is enormous. One way to quantify this also is, many people feel that the last decade we made an enormous amount of progress. And we did. But we changed the global energy mix by 2% towards renewables. So that's like 0.2 a year. Just do 2020, 2050, that's 3% per year for the remainder. That's 15 to 20 times faster. That's right. We're not there yet because it's hard. And this report says it's hard. It's 8% per year hard. Let's go problem solve that question instead of pushing all kinds of things without knowing whether it adds up and not making the explicit trade-off to what the train is that we need to build.
Now, in the context of India, Sven, and this question I will also lob to you, Gautam, after Sven answers his point of view, is that in a country like India, you sort of hinted at a K-shaped growth, where the rich, the top percentile is getting richer, and not the same thing is not happening at the bottom. But the point I'm making is, in that context, do you really feel that these growth objectives, which you say can really unleash entrepreneurial energy? We talked a lot about how India is progressing towards 2047, how ease of doing business has become a government priority, how startups are taking place. Are you therefore, and that's where this whole optimism discussion comes back, are you feeling therefore that countries like India may be in a better position to sort of free up the entrepreneurial energies and go quicker towards freeing up the, getting the growth objective to pay partly for the 8% gap in that sense?
So I've been coming for 25 years to India, and I think it never felt this good. Now, we all know in India things can be volatile, but the reality is you probably have reached a scale point at which a lot of things can be unleashed. And to me, it's not a question of the potential of India, it's whether you can get it done. So all the things you mentioned, if they happen at pace and scale, why would India not have a similar right that China has had? You need to do many things. You have access to resources, infrastructure, regulation, permitting. You know, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be orchestrated. But if the mindset is there and it starts to produce the engine across growth, inclusion, and sustainability, the advantage of India is it does it a bit more from scratch, with, by the way, great education on technology, which is driving all of this. And doing it from scratch might mean that you don't have all the legacy leapfrog. Now, I would say building a grid in India is hard too, but just try one in the Netherlands, or in Germany, or in New York.
Gautam, you know, this whole digital ecosystem which India is building, do you think that's also going to be, I mean, one key pillar which will sort of power this growth and unleashing of entrepreneurial energy, which can pay for this gap partly?
Absolutely. I think if you mentioned digital infrastructure, the reality is that what India has created here is really something that we should be exporting to elsewhere in the world, because it is truly something very unique. And the fact is, today we are already the largest digital payments market in the world. I think we are
46% of all global digital payments happen.
Here you go, in numbers. And I think the reality is it is making a difference to efficiency in the entire public spend. You look at direct benefits transfer, I believe there's 10% or more of savings happening there. So firstly, yes, things like digital and others will enable this journey by making it more cost efficient and more effective and driving inclusivity. The other thing I would say is, going back to your question about why we are optimistic, you know, I talked about empowerment. If you look at the energy transition side, you see the good news is 80% of India still has to be built, right? If you look at over the next 30 years, 80% of India still has to be built. And what that does is it presents a massive opportunity, right? In fact, it's not energy transition, I call it energy build for India. So it's actually energy build for India. And that presents a massive opportunity, because look at what this means for, I mean, we all know renewables, we're already one of the top 3 in the world. Installed capacity in India is already one of the top 3 in the world, but it's going to pan out in every sector. You look at hydrogen. I have zero doubt India will be one of the first countries to get to very competitive cost of green hydrogen, or further innovation in carbon storage.
That's beginning to happen.
It's beginning to happen. You see the number of announcements, and I have a lot of confidence in the Indian entrepreneurship and frugal engineering and innovation. And I think that will actually help us. I'm hoping that what we've been able to demonstrate in the engineering sector, in the life sciences sector, in the IT services sector, which is really the ingenuity of Indian business leaders and the entrepreneurship and the skill base. I think if we can apply that to these new emerging challenges, you know, whether it's energy transition or energy build, there's no reason why we can't also set an example for the world how to make this happen.
Sven, I come to this a little contentious topic, which I found was discussed pretty animatedly yesterday at the G-20 inaugural session, about you know, taxing the top corporates. You know, getting 0.2% is what was told at that point yesterday at the session. That 0.2% of their profits they should top corporates across the world should earmark for a sustainability and climate change kind of action. Today, Mr. Kant in the session in the earlier part of the day actually upped it to 1%. And he said he is going to take this up, and the G20 countries will discuss it at the Leaders Summit in September. Now, do you think that is actually feasible? Do you think corporates will sort of be able to set aside this money and will be willing to do that?
So I'm intrigued by that number, because I actually don't fully know what the number is today. With some metrics that we looked at, it could be that in the area of CapEx towards climate transition, the number might already be bigger, and in some areas it will be lower. So we're setting a goal against...
no, for instance, in India, there is a 2% norm. That's a rule.
Yeah. But what I meant is the actual number of what's already happening, we don't know. So before you know it, you set a norm that's below what already happens or above. You know, at 2, it starts to be a quarter of the world's profits. And you can say that's no problem, but that's also a quarter of the world's pensions. Because the profits are not just going to owners. The majority of the owners in the world are the pension funds, the healthcare funds. So we just need to be a little careful that we give something away without understanding the knock-on confidence on empowerment, because if people's pensions go as a consequence, if not, it's a different issue. And at point 2, that is, of course, much less sensitive. But, 2 starts to bite in a quarter of the profits of the world. And that, has serious implications for who is currently the recipient of that profit, which is largely the people's pensions and healthcare.
A related issue to that, Gautam, is the restructuring of multilateral development banks. And that's a key point in the agenda of the B20 and, of course, the G20. The Prime Minister, in his interview to us, has also spoken about this. He is driving this. There are 2 reports, one report is out and the other one is about to come out. Now, that is going to be key to, sort of moving funds from the developed countries to the global south, and that's where a lot of the action and a lot of the growth will come from going forward. So do you think that is going to be playing a critical role in what you say, getting the money out for this, bridging this 8% of GDP gap in the road ahead?
Yes, no, I'm aware. In fact, it's earlier this week, I was on a panel with N.K. Singh, who was actually the co-convener of that with Larry Summers. So I have not seen yet the content of the report, but I think and I agree with that, I think, if we go back to what Sven said, I think half of the funding gap, so if you look at just the energy transition, we talk about 40 trillion roughly over the next 10 years, half of that is still not clear how it's going to be funded. So I actually think the deliberations that are going on in the multilateral bank reform, I think is going to be critical, because it is not, unless some unlocking has to be done, some formulation of public finance, some formulation of blended finance to bring much more of these clean tech technologies into the money. I think things like that are going to be quite critical. So I do think that this is a solution that will require global alignment, global coordination, and certainly some stronger measures to catalyze this curve. Otherwise, it will be slow.
Maybe one addition to this. As we start to increase the money that can go to this thing, let's just make sure that we spend it at the right place. And there are 2 right places, in my view. The technologies that are in the money now. So they're not only helping the climate, but they're already in the money, and as a result, they make energy cheaper for the people. The second good place is to spend it in innovation, so that the future technology becomes cheaper. The place where you need to be careful is to roll out where it's too expensive today, because that will, then the 2% or whatever the number is, or the 4%, will actually be an implicit cost increase for the people, which will make them less empowered. So the discussion should be in the money now, innovate for future in the money, maybe less roll out what is totally not affordable at the moment.
As we come to the end of time for this session, I would like to ask you, Sven, one question which was very interesting as part of the report. While you advocate a cohesive approach to development as net zero, you also talk about potential conflicts. You talk about a conflict between, because as that happens, there will be cost of energy will go up, and the overall costs will go up for the common person. Now, could you elaborate a little bit on that conflict?
So if we blindly say transition at any cost, the any cost will bite into empowerment. It will actually also bite into growth. If we blindly say grow at any cost, we'll be very irresponsible on the environment side. If we say empower at any cost, we might do it with taxation, which will kill the engine too. The solutions that you have is if you do sustainable, inclusive growth at the same time are very different, and even different than some of the solutions we pursue today. And they will then reduce this tension. We need to reduce this tension, not solve it one by one.
So inclusive growth, along with the net zero target being met, is the report which McKinsey Global Institute talks about. It's a fascinating report, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for elaborating on aspects of that. Thank you.
Thank you.